So, in the last video of the series, I spoke at length about how much of an impact that Lauren Faust had on cartoons in the late 90s and early 2000s, citing herself and Craig McKraken as one of the most iconic duos of that era of cartoons, and even today for a myriad of reasons. That being said, however, I don't think just as quickly mentioning one particular show could do as much justice on the matter to how much it impacted me personally in my life to where I am now. So, for what it's worth, I want to cast your mind back to that era of the 90s where it was about to hit the turn of the millennium. Cartoon Network is arguably about to enter its golden years with shows like Dexter's Lab, Johnny Bravo, but among all of that lineup they had to offer was one that stood out amongst the more male-dominated spots of its time, and one that would arguably outlive all of them in terms of their staying power. And all it took was a little bit of sugar, spice, everything nice, and a little added extra something else to the mix.
Thus, the Powerpuff Girls were born! Using their ultra superpowers, Blossom, Bubbles, and Buttercup have dedicated their lives to fighting crime and the forces of evil!
Welcome to In Transition, a mini video essay series discussing the differing bits of media that have helped me on my ongoing journey to being the woman I am today. And today, we're going back to the 90s and early 2000s to discuss one piece of media that impacted a lot of queer people in the West that has seen, a lot better days recently, with the original Powerpuff Girls. Now, if you watched my last episode at In Transition and heard me talk at length about how much Lauren Faust is an incredible writer when she was working on My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, you'd know that I praised her work on Powerpuff Girls at length, with that being the high point of her working relationship between herself and Craig McKraken. But there was one topic I didn't really get to cover all that much in great detail, and that was the topic of girls' shows in the West and how indulging in them as a child and even as an adolescent can be a bit hard for those outside the target demographic for a lot of reasons. Similar to the vein of an adult continuing to watch children's shows once a child has lost interest, or even indulging in them without having a child involved these days. However, a lot of you may be asking to yourselves, okay, girls shows have a pretty broad definition here, Chloe. What exactly do you mean by girls shows in this context? Well, I'm glad that you asked that, pedantic viewer at home who is just as pedantic as I am. Let me explain. In the context of today's discussion, the topic of girls' shows is explicitly referring to the types of shows which, compared to the more male-oriented or more male characters in its main cast, has more female-oriented plotlines or females in the main cast. Obvious examples include topics we've covered in the past, such as Sailor Moon in comparison to Power Rangers, and My Little Pony compared to Transformers. Think of this as covering the overall relationship of girls' shows versus boys' shows as being a contrast, where while the mediums may have plots that may convey the interest of the opposite gender, they are at their core being targeted towards one particular gendered audience. However, there's also the kinds of mediums that aren't explicitly falling into a camp with such a distinct difference, like today's topic, where despite it having such an ambiguously gendered structure to it, with having the main cast of girls doing acts that you would mainly see in boy-orientated shows, compared to the previously mentioned shows at the start that were discussed, it could be seen as the only female-orientated alternative in an early lineup that was more male-targeted and would remain that way for the majority of its lineup that we're seeing today. With that being said, however, Powerpuff Girls isn't necessarily a straightforward concept of being labeled as just a girls' show with an edge, because for what it's worth, it's actually very much a show for that demographic at its heart with how it ends up being portrayed. So as May mentioned to death by this point, Powerpuff Girls was a part of the original 6 series that started in 1998 and that basically became the big breakout shows for Cartoon Network, originating from the What a Cartoon block shorts that would air often on the network, with it being how the shows that ran alongside it, like the aforementioned Dexter's Lab and Johnny Bravo, got their start as well. And I want to focus on those two as a counterpoint to how Powerpuff Girls was shown in contrast, because you have shows like Dexter's Lab which had a male protagonist who had an annoying little sister who constantly plays foil to him from episode to episode, and then you have Johnny Bravo, where the male character could easily be mistaken for a himbo misogynist, with a bit of a heart of gold at his core, always stirring up trouble by playing into typical male archetypes. Compare that to Powerpuff Girls, which focus primarily on the day-to-day adventures and crime fighting of 3 genetically made 6-year-old girls, and you can clearly see where the differences primarily lie. You could almost compare it as a slice of life series for girls, while also having aspects that boys would easily be drawn to as well. And that's kind of where it starts to make sense, doesn't it? Yeah, the kind of audience that would be expected from a show like that in comparison to everything around it would make one lean towards this being a show boys wouldn't exactly be so eager to flock towards, given how effeminate it was. And yet, for some boys, it was just as easy to watch this as it was anything else at the time that they were marketed to. And while we're going to touch on the aspects of that later on because those are really important to why we're here today, I feel giving the background to that level would have things make a lot more sense for when we eventually get to talking about just not my own personal experiences growing up around this, but the experiences of many others as well. But to its credit, it's not just about how it was marketed towards that has made it such an ingrained part of queer culture. I mean, do I need to talk about him at all? The insanely flaming gay stereotype that just looks like every conservative's worst nightmare all jumbled up into one? Or what about the fact that there are multiple, albeit dated and very close to problematic, instances of male characters dressing in drag shirt on display? Yes, it's still played for comedy at times, sure, but we're still in the 90s here, people. But to dare to do this so often it feels like there is a quota to meet for one per season, it feels less like a bit of comedy and more like them bending the boundaries of what you would expect for cartoons like this, especially during the time that it aired. Take, for example, one episode in particular where the plot is taken to an interesting degree and kind of looks at what we've brought about so far to an extreme degree, slumbering with the enemy. An episode for which focuses on a more stereotypical feminine-focused activity, that being of an all-girls sleepover, and Mojo coming in as part of it. Now, in a series where these kinds of episodes are few and far between, showing the main trio as, well, stereotypical girls, watching this with the audience that it gathered by its second season shows that it wasn't afraid to remind the said audience that yes, this is a show about girls, and it wasn't ashamed about it or how it portrayed femininity. But honestly, if you misgender Mojisha, we're gonna have some issues real quick. I feel like honestly that kind of in-your-face nature adds to the overall flair that the show had going for it. Given that for the majority of the show's run, its longevity through 6 seasons could have easily had it get away with these types of topics being displayed, as well as taking a lot of things seriously when it needs to, like how it would often have historical facts in early seasons of the show sprinkled throughout. It showed that the series could be not only something that appealed to the eyes, but something that could be more appealing to the mind as well, despite its showcase being more focused on action and crime fighting than the other aspects previously mentioned. That didn't, however, stop it from creating an impact on an impressionable audience, however. In a way, shows like that were essentially the bread and butter growing up, and while I did still indulge in stuff that was more targeted towards me as a child, I didn't shy away from the fact that I did still enjoy the ones that I was told were not meant for me. And in all honesty, given how much Powerpuff basically gave to the culture of younger children who grew up with it during its airing time frame, it's no wonder it basically became so iconic to a lot of 20-something queers these days, given how much it broke the norms of what you would expect of shows like this. Now, I've talked a lot about the more overt stuff in this show, but to those that became trans women that grew up with this show, did you ever have an irrational feeling of disgust the moment you saw the Rowdy roughs? Or was that just me? Okay, yes. Obviously the more obvious attempts at masculinity being shown as a negative in this show were high, and a lot of the villains the girls faced off against being male were basically expected. But having a direct counterpart to them being gender bends was the moment I realized, wait, am I meant to be like this? And as we all know by now, the gears start turning in your head seeing this and you go, wait, no, I don't like this. And given how much more exaggerated they become when they return later in the series, growing up with this show and seeing their return and having a visceral reaction to all of their antics, it's no wonder that I just really did not feel comfortable with masculinity if this was what I had to conform to. Thoughts like that plagued me for essentially my entire childhood as a result, but it gave a lot of pause as I grew older on why I ended up deviating away from that kind of mentality and really didn't choose to conform to the typical male attributes that it presented, and especially of what was expected of me. And I attribute feelings like that to aspects in shows like this that really brought about that contrast to the forefront, while also giving more ideals on stuff like feminism to the forefront as well, as shown in the now controversial episode Equal Fights, which as a kid kid kind of flew over my head on what the moral truly was until I grew a lot older to be able to appreciate it fully. But at the time, the idea of not treating girls like garbage was what I took away from it, and it sort of stuck with me for a long time, and I feel contributed to how I perceive gendered actions in a way. This, on top of a lot of other things the show constantly showcases about the concept of gender and how it basically takes a few punches to the stereotypes for the most part, in my opinion, it makes it one of the more quintessential pieces of media in my childhood that affected those around it. And admittedly, it had a lot more ripple effects than one would think. By now you can more or less put the two and two together that I was one of those kids that grew up around Powerpuff Girls as an AMAB who had no real idea about the differences between gendered products really meant in the long term. I basically viewed it as nothing more than just another cartoon that looked nice. And while that may have been something that raised a lot of eyebrows back when I was growing up and did at times make it a bit hard for me to try and explain myself about why I like this, and really any 5-year-old who has to go through that, I personally gotta give you credit for being honest about that, because getting grilled on why you're not going for the more targeted stuff for your gender is certainly a time. For instance, one memory that sticks in my head constantly about this show is watching it whenever it came on free-to-air TV, since we didn't have exclusive Cartoon Network channels here in Australia until around about the mid-2000s, and by that point they were hidden behind a paywall like cable for all my US viewers out there. Add into that with me having to be grilled by my dad on why I chose to get a VHS of the series when there was literally anything else for me to choose from at the time when I was like 6? And you get an idea on why I was confused about being so interested in media like this for so long. But it was in instances like that where I first had the question of why is this such an odd thing for me to like came into my mind growing up, as I hadn't really learned by that point that boys are meant to like these things and girls are meant to like the others. And to me, it didn't really matter. But according to society at large, I had to care about it, otherwise I'd be teased for it. So to the people that knew me, I'd talk about stuff like Dragon Ball Z, Pokemon, Transformers, and all the other stuff that was more targeted towards my birth gender. But at home, when nobody really bothered to ask questions about it, I just enjoyed what I wanted to enjoy, even if it wasn't specifically made for me. And I guess as an even further aside to how things kind of went about to me personally, you know how some people will just, I guess, stan certain characters? Well, for me personally, when I grew up, I stan Buttercup so much, if only for the fact that I love the color green, and I felt a bit more of a kinship to her due to her more tomboyish behavior.
Wanna arm wrestle? Don't you know that only big fat sissies take baths? Typical guys see some curves, turn into gibbering idiots. Not like I care! We're gonna hit them head on and kick some monster butt.
But what about your sensitive side?
What about it?
But as I've grown older, I've become more in tune, I guess, with my feminine side proper. I've sort of realized I'm more like Bubbles in most aspects, and no, it's not just because of the blonde hair. I'm also a bit of an overly emotional gal myself who sleeps with way too many plushies for her own good and is, I guess, marginally more innocent-minded for my own good.
I'm sensitive, you know.
And you don't blame me! I think it's all my fault!
It is your fault. Why would they do that? That's really, really mean. That's how you get rid of a monster, you big fat doo-doo-headed nurse! Hey, you want a piece of me?
That's not to say that Blossom isn't in there somewhere, given the fact that she's considered the more rounded of the trio. Like their heads. But in my opinion, the aspects I take from her aren't necessarily the ones you know her for, like her leadership skills or her being the smart one, because, well, I'm a bimbo, what can you do about it? But if there's anything I took from Blossom, I guess, it had to be the confidence.
It's our responsibility as superheroines to be well-rested so that we'll be at peak crime-fighting performance whenever evil rears its ugly head. I'm cute. Look at this bow. Oh, okay. I just gotta finish making snow cones for everybody. Can't you abacus a little faster? Abacus my foot.
You get the point by now, though. Every single one of the trio basically shaped myself subconsciously as I grew up, and sort of ingrained one aspect as to one would deem as things to aspire towards in the process of being me. And the show's impact as a whole has a lot to do with it, really. And while I could go on a little bit of a rant and say something to the effect of, the 2016 reboot of the show is a terrible atrocity that shouldn't exist and only serves to besmirch the good that Craig and Lauren did with such an amazing show to begin with, I'm not gonna do that. I will, however, say this about it. From what I have seen of the 2016 reboot, and that is very little, so we are aware, it appears it doesn't get what made Powerpuff Girls at its core of it so good to begin with. Everyone in the show feels like a flanderized version of the ones from the original, and it either retreads old episode plots from the original show badly, or does the opposite of what made them special in the first place. Not only that, but with its outright blatant attempts at pandering to modern audiences and doing much worse storylines in that it makes Teen Titans Go look like the better show by comparison, it feels like a soulless cash grab on a series that deserved a way better revival, which unfortunately was a big theme for Cartoon Network in the late 2010s. That being said, however, it doesn't ruin what came before, and in my opinion makes it a lot more easier to cherish despite its flaws. Yes, a lot of the morals are hokey, cheesy, and even a bit dated for the times. Yes, a lot of the plots are a bit problematic looking back at it for the time. But if we've learned anything from previous outings on these lookbacks, it's that even things that are problematic can somewhat be looked back on fondly in certain aspects. As without the Powerpuff Girls being what it was and still is for me, there's a good chance it would have made me more open to exploring more media choices as I grew older. I would have stayed in my gendered lane all my life and never branched out to anything that was too girly or didn't have boys as the focal point, and my life would have been worse off for it. So, while it may not have been one of the bigger ones to impact my journey, this and one other show we're going to talk about down the line has had rippling effects that were felt for years to come for me, and allowed me to feel more comfortable with the idea of enjoying more shows in a similar vein. And at the end of it all, I wouldn't have asked for any better way to have grown up, even if it did make life a lot harder in the long term to navigate, as shows like this were pivotal to discovering my own inner aspects of sugar, spice, and everything nice. Thank you all for watching this episode on In Transition on Powerpuff Girls. This one was a bit of a long time coming for those that probably watched my My Little Pony video where I discussed it, and also a little bit where I discussed it in an update video a year ago, and I'm glad that I finally got around to it because, well, getting to talk about both of Lord Faust's work is pretty good in my opinion, and it got a lot personal this time around, so I'm really glad that I got to share a lot more in this video, and as you can see here, things are slowly coming into shape for me to do this a lot more often, and I'm really glad for that. For those of you who are new to watching In Transition, or just my videos in general, up here is going to be a playlist of all the recent In Transition videos all in one playlist, including my last one on MLP. You can click that up where Piggy is. Down there as well, you will also see my latest videos as well. It will either be my booth building video, or it will be potentially another video. I'm not sure if I'm gonna get that one out in time. However, if you're interested in that one, it's gonna be a ranking on every episode of the Powerpuff Girls, and that's either gonna come out either before this video is out or sometime shortly after. But either way, thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe, like, do all the bits and bobs that YouTube requires in order to gain traction in this algorithm these days. And until next time, catch you later.